Senator Adam Schiff sat rigidly under the blinding, unforgiving glare of the Senate Judiciary Committee's halogen lighting, completely unaware that his 2.5-decade political reign was moments from utter destruction. Earlier that day, the tension trapped inside room 226 of the Dirksen Senate office building went far beyond ordinary anxiety. It was aggressively predatory, with an atmosphere so thick it hummed with the ruthless expectation that fuels Washington insiders. Officially, this heavily covered proceeding was sanitized with the bureaucratic title of Accountability for Misconduct in Congressional Intelligence Oversight, a calculated label designed to project the illusion of standard administrative procedure. Yet every seasoned journalist gripping a microphone, every drained political staffer, and every politician positioned on the polished mahogany seats understood the lethal stakes of the spectacle about to unfold. Senator Adam Schiff, a recently inaugurated Democratic senator from California who had just wrapped up a cutthroat 20-year run in the House, was teetering on the edge of being pulverized by the inescapable and terrifying weight of sworn testimony. The inquiry's crosshairs were locked onto the 7 relentless years he spent commanding American broadcast networks, tirelessly attempting to convince the public that the 45th president was a compromised Russian operative. Positioned at the witness table, Schiff looked thoroughly insulated by his own mythos. He was guarded by the flawless, custom-tailored hubris of a top-tier political survivor, a man who had effortlessly sailed through the chaotic wake of 2 brutal impeachments, brushed off a humiliating formal House censure, and racked up exactly 423 cable television appearances without ever dropping his rehearsed broadcast composure. He held the impeccable, statuesque posture of an apex predator, completely confident in his intellectual dominance over any room, historically safely buffered within the D.C. establishment's echo chamber. That supreme confidence had always been rewarded. But this specific hearing wasn't concerned with Schiff's undeniable brainpower. The horrifying question hanging in the climate-controlled air was how he had intentionally and vindictively weaponized that intelligence to obliterate the lives of others. Presiding over the room from the elevated wooden dais was Vice President J.D. Vance, fulfilling his constitutional role as President of the Senate. The visual disparity between the two men was immediate and striking, primarily because Vance's massive desk was noticeably bare. It lacked the usual neon legal sticky notes, towering stacks of classified dossiers, or the dramatic visual props typically deployed in congressional inquiries. Instead, one single, unadorned manila folder sat perfectly aligned on the polished surface in front of him, waiting there like a loaded weapon. Inside that deceptively thin file lay exactly 5 standard pieces of paper. At the very crest of each sheet, printed in harsh, unapologetic black text, was a distinct name. Before the vice president could even finish the routine parliamentary introductions, Schiff deployed his signature weaponized maneuver, a calculated, overpowering interruption. His voice instantly echoed throughout the massive chamber, carrying the practiced, rhythmic cadence of a former federal prosecutor who had never truly stepped out of the courtroom. It was an inflection biologically engineered to dictate the terms of engagement, emitting an unspoken warning that he had been calling the plays in this legislative arena for over 2 decades. Glaring up at Vance with a measuring rather than dismissive eye, Schiff correctly assessed that he was facing a younger adversary he had not yet entirely mapped out. Schiff's rhetorical delivery was an instrument of absolute exactness, honed over 24 years into a conversational weapon as precise as a Swiss watch and as coldly tactical as a Swiss bank. He brazenly charged the vice president to his face, while the assembled press watched with orchestrating a politically motivated vendetta, bluntly asserting that the new administration had weaponized the Department of Justice to ruthlessly hunt down its ideological enemies. He pointed to the public demands for probes and the resulting reluctance of career prosecutors in Maryland to charge him due to insufficient evidence, painting the entire inquiry as a farcical theatrical display. He initiated a frontal attack on the administration's controversial track record of firing inspectors general and dismantling established intelligence structures simply to demand blind obedience. Leaning aggressively into the microphone, jaw locked in absolute defiance, he essentially informed the vice president that Vance possessed zero moral standing to lecture him on the intricacies of political oversight. The gallery murmured, instantly captivated by the immense gravitational pull of Schiff's undeniable eloquence. Seated above on the dais, Vance simply listened, absorbing the venomous accusations without betraying a single physical reaction. He didn't narrow his eyes at the phrase revenge tour. He didn't bristle at being called a stage manager, and he offered no defensive flinch at the implication that he was merely a loyalist puppet. Vance maintained the hardened, inflexible poise of a man whose turbulent Midwestern childhood had subjected him to volatile screaming matches far more brutal and psychologically damaging than anything an elite California senator could dish out from the security of a committee broadcast. When the final echo of Schiff's Otho-winning barrage faded into the room's strained quiet, Vance methodically and agonizingly slowly flipped open the manila folder. He stared down at the initial document for an extended, excruciating second before shifting his unwavering, icy gaze back down to the witness desk. When Vance finally spoke, his voice was anchored in a flat, unyielding Midwestern rhythm, a tone intentionally devoid of Washington theatrics, belonging to someone who never required extra volume to assert complete control. He dryly, almost clinically, thanked the senator for his introductory statement, noting with surgical precision that his own grandmother used to shout at the television and was far more convincing, though he respected the performative effort. A muted, deeply nervous ripple of laughter washed over the gallery, yet Vance's face remained rigidly locked. He immediately stripped away all the anticipated political battlefields, systematically shutting down any debates regarding Russian collusion hypotheses, the convoluted labyrinth of FISA court applications, or the looming federal investigations into Schiff's private Maryland mortgages, pointedly reserving those dense legal matters for the Director of National Intelligence and the Attorney General to unravel. Instead, Vance's eyes locked onto the open dossier, his voice dropping to a frequency of profound gravity that instantly altered the chamber's climate. He announced that the sole subject of this proceeding would be human beings, specific, vulnerable people whose lives Schiff had personally touched and irrevocably shattered. He was not there to argue over heavily redacted intelligence reports. He was there to force a brutal reckoning regarding the ordinary Americans whose livelihoods were decimated simply to boost primetime cable viewership. These were the people who shouldered the devastating financial and social wreckage of Schiff's meticulously curated fictions, people who never received a single apology, and people whom the senator had undoubtedly forgotten the moment the camera's tally lights flipped off. Vance turned the first page and let the initial name drop into the suffocating silence of room 226 like a heavy stone plunging into black water. Carter Page. He recited the man's history not with the typical spite of a political hatchet man, but with the detached, inescapable precision of a military roll call. A graduate of the United States Naval Academy, class of 1993, a loyal citizen who had proudly worn the country's uniform as a Marine intelligence officer, and who subsequently operated legally and openly within Moscow's complex energy sector with the full knowledge and occasional collaboration of American intelligence agencies. Vance systematically dismantled the sinister mythology, clarifying that Page was merely a peripheral, incredibly brief volunteer energy consultant during the disorganized 2016 Trump campaign. He was a man who attended only a few low-tier meetings and drafted a couple of benign memos completely cut off from any inner circle of true executive power. Yet, Vance emphasized, his eyes narrowing with controlled, icy fury, Schiff had eagerly leveraged his unparalleled congressional platform to violently morph this military veteran into the most notorious alleged Russian espionage agent in modern U.S. history. Down at the witness table, Schiff made a microscopic adjustment, a barely perceptible change in posture that betrayed the sudden dawn of a man who felt the tactical earth actively dissolving beneath his designer footwear. Vance ruthlessly pounded away with indisputable facts, reminding the hushed room how Schiff had aggressively defended the severely compromised FISA surveillance applications on national television, deploying the immense institutional gravity of the House Intelligence Committee chairmanship to publicly validate a legally rotten process. The vice president methodically flipped to the second page, summoning the undeniable specter of Inspector General Horowitz's devastating report, which officially documented 17 massive, catastrophic errors and intentional, malicious omissions within those very warrant applications. He deliberately invoked the name of Kevin Kleinsmith, the disgraced FBI attorney who had pleaded guilty to purposely altering a federal email to falsely state Carter Page was not an active CIA source, a direct illegal manipulation of evidence utilized specifically to unlawfully surveil an American citizen. Vance's voice cut through the atmosphere like a scalpel, highlighting that Carter Page, a man relentlessly vilified across 423 distinct television appearances by Schiff himself, had never been formally charged with a single crime. No indictments, no handcuffs, no courtroom trials, zero convictions. Schiff leaned aggressively into his microphone, his automatic, deeply conditioned defensive instincts flaring as he frantically searched for procedural cover. He stammered slightly, a rare occurrence, desperately clinging to the technicality that the FISA processes had been formally authorized by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. It was a hollow deflection that was immediately destroyed by the horrifying reality that the court itself had been intentionally spoon-fed forged evidence by the exact agency Schiff was blindly protecting. Vance didn't elevate his volume or sharpen his tone. His voice simply pushed forward, as relentless and inescapable as a river surging around a stubborn rock. He icily asked if Schiff had even taken the time to read the entire 6-page Inspector General's report, leaving Schiff's mouth hanging open in limbo for an agonizing half-second. It was the naked, terrified gap between frantically searching for a rhetorical shield and realizing with total clarity that no such shield existed. Vance didn't linger for the empty response, snapping sharply back to the agonizing human reality, explaining how a decorated Naval Academy graduate was now completely unhireable. Page's identity had morphed into a deeply toxic liability, utterly radioactive, not just politically, but in a very real corporate recruitment sense. After the sprawling Mueller probe that officially cleared him of all suspicion, Page had aggressively sought employment at 3 separate prestigious energy consulting firms, only to be methodically and coldly rejected by every single one. The rejections weren't due to a deficit of stellar qualifications or profound industry expertise. They were wholly dictated by the inescapable algorithmic snare of Google search results. The top 40 links permanently tethered his name to a treasonous international conspiracy he never participated in, a digital indelible wound carved entirely by Schiff's unchecked broadcast tirades. Vance relayed the off-the-record confession of a panicked HR executive who admitted they simply couldn't onboard Page because their corporate clients would instantly see his name and associate him with Russian espionage. The vice president allowed the horrific gravity of that reality to settle deeply into the committee members. A private citizen, utterly lacking the protective shield of a government pension or a massive campaign war chest, was forced to incinerate hundreds of thousands of dollars of his own wealth to legally repair a reputation that Schiff had gleefully annihilated for free. Even after Mueller, Horowitz, and Durham had all conclusively proven his absolute innocence, Carter Page remained a ghost in the employment sector. Vance locked his gaze on Schiff, accusing the senator of tossing Page aside the exact moment the narrative crumbled, refusing to broadcast a public correction, failing to retract the devastating allegations, and silently sweeping the destroyed life back into a dark corner like a discarded prop from a finished magic act. The sharp rustle of the second page turning echoed loudly through the sensitive committee microphones as Vance shifted his unyielding focus to the next high-profile casualty of the narrative war, Lieutenant General Michael Flynn. Vance read the staggering military background with deliberate, agonizing slowness, compelling everyone present to internalize the massive weight of a 33-year career in the United States Army. He highlighted the 5 grueling combat deployments and the prestigious ultra-classified tenure serving as the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency under the Obama administration. Every spoken word represented an exhausting year of relentless sacrifice, a dangerous overseas operation executed flawlessly, and terrifying life or death decisions made at 3 a.m. in secured bunkers where a single error meant American bodies returning to Dover. Vance's typically even voice suddenly constricted, his jaw visibly tightening in a physical, unmistakable manifestation of deep personal fury. He referenced his own service as a Marine, fiercely declaring that every soldier, sailor, and Marine universally knew Flynn not as a slick political strategist, but as an undeniable brother-in-arms, a dedicated, lethal warfighter who fundamentally understood that precise intelligence directly translated to saved lives on active, bloody battlefields. Yet, Vance accused, his voice thick with a restrained, highly concentrated contempt, Schiff had chosen to systematically dismantle this decorated officer's legacy on national television purely for the benefit of cheap ratings. Schiff had recklessly and maliciously branded him a compromised Russian asset long before any solid evidence was gathered, violently stripping away the sacred constitutional presumption of innocence that Schiff, as a former federal prosecutor, had sworn an oath to protect. Schiff frantically lunged toward his microphone again, attempting to inject the cold, clinical, legal argument that Flynn had originally pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI. Vance effortlessly and brutally swatted the interruption aside, weaponizing the undeniable reality of the FBI's own handwritten internal notes, historical documents that couldn't be retroactively conjured or altered. He definitively proved that the actual field agents who interrogated Flynn did not believe he was exhibiting deceptive behavior. While Schiff desperately attempted to resuscitate the procedural defense, clinging to the dry details of the subsequent presidential pardon and the dismissed legal cases, Vance mercilessly dragged the spotlight back to the raw, hemorrhaging human catastrophe that unfolded prior to those complex legal maneuvers. The vice president painted a devastating, intensely visual, emotionally crushing picture. A 3-star general, a man who dedicated over 3 decades of his life to defending the country, sitting completely broken at a sterile closing table in Virginia, physically signing over the deed to the beloved family home where he had raised his children. Flynn was forced to liquidate his entire life's foundation just to survive the suffocating, apocalyptic tidal wave of legal fees generated specifically because a California congressman had persistently branded him a traitor to the Republic. Vance meticulously detailed the total evaporation of Flynn's hard-earned retirement, the sudden cowardly cancellation of lucrative corporate speaking engagements, and the heartbreaking disappearance of lifelong friends who were absolutely terrified of the collateral damage of standing near a man whose face CNN continuously broadcast alongside the flashing red word compromised. It wasn't merely the loss of real estate, it was the total systemic erasure of a life rightfully earned through 33 years of blood and sweat. And while this decorated veteran was literally selling the roof over his family's head to weather the onslaught, Vance noted with a tone dripping with absolute disgust, Schiff was busy manufacturing reality. The vice president ruthlessly reminded the committee of the infamous September 2019 phone call between President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky, detailing how Schiff had brazenly and theatrically read a completely invented, highly embellished version of that transcript aloud during a televised congressional hearing. Schiff purposefully made up dialogue, altered vital contexts, and intentionally injected words that were never actually spoken, doing all of this under the solemn official banner of the Intelligence Committee he chaired. When ultimately cornered by the release of the actual verified transcript, Schiff spinelessly attempted to wave off the blatant deception as a mere parody. Vance shook his head in slow, profound disbelief, highlighting the nauseating, grotesque hypocrisy. While General Flynn was liquidating his home to defend himself from Schiff's previous lies, the chairman was already hard at work drafting his next catastrophic fiction. Moreover, Vance pointed out with a razor-sharp edge, Schiff was currently staring down an aggressive federal investigation for allegedly engaging in his own fraudulent mortgage schemes. The third page turned, and Vance's inflection instantly softened, adopting a specific, fiercely protective gentleness reserved exclusively for those who are intrinsically too young and agonizingly innocent to deserve the crushing weight of federal annihilation. The name George Papadopoulos hung in the heavy air. He was a mere 28 years old in 2016, just a kid. He wasn't a seasoned intelligence director nor a callous political operative, but a young guy from Chicago, fueled by a genuine, starry-eyed passion for international relations and a legitimate drive to work in foreign policy. Vance directly ordered the hardened, jaded politicians in the room to vividly remember the exact feeling of being 28, a period defined by the fragile, unbroken belief that playing by the rules and working hard will naturally lead to success, a phase of life existing just before the brutal realization that a weaponized government doesn't care about justice when it desperately requires a convenient fall guy. Vance pivoted his entire torso toward Schiff, systematically dismantling the sinister myths surrounding Papadopoulos. He stripped away the grandiose illusions of international spycraft, clarifying that the young man was nothing more than a low-tier peripheral aide attending standard campaign meetings. The vice president then meticulously unveiled the horrifying, heavily documented reality unearthed by Special Counsel John Durham. It was the FBI, operating on the absolute flimsiest and most pathetic of pretexts, that had aggressively deployed undercover assets to deliberately target, approach, and entrap the eager young staffer. They proactively dangled conversations about Russian intelligence, artificially manufacturing the precise illegal connections they were supposedly tasked with investigating. He stressed the agonizing absurdity of Papadopoulos' ultimate fate, a devastating 12-day stint in federal prison rooted entirely in a fundamentally meaningless procedural error. The young man hadn't maliciously lied about a secret rendezvous taking place. He had merely recalled the exact chronological timeline of the meeting incorrectly during a high-pressure, terrifying FBI ambush interview. Still, Schiff shamelessly plastered this young man's face across national television networks, breathlessly touting a 28-year-old's honest calendar mistake as the absolute smoking gun of a sprawling, sinister web of global Russian collusion. Vance's voice dripped with raw, unadulterated scorn as he weighed Papadopoulos' crushing defenselessness against Schiff's bulletproof aristocratic status. The kid from Chicago possessed no multi-million-dollar legal war chest, no deeply entrenched political protectors, and no blank checks authorized by the California Democratic machine. He had absolutely nothing except his modest life savings, the panicked, terrified support of his mother and father, and a shattered dream of public service that Schiff effortlessly converted into a permanent criminal record without ever losing a millisecond of sleep. Schiff, visibly rattled by the relentless psychological assault, nervously cleared his throat, attempting to mount a weak counteroffensive by claiming that the Durham investigation had been harshly scrutinized by the very individuals it targeted. Vance's response was instantaneous and surgically lethal, concurring with a freezing smirk that convicted felons historically exhibit a strong tendency to bitterly complain about the law enforcement investigations that successfully apprehended them. The retort landed with the physical force of a backhand. Schiff's jaw visibly snapped shut, not the controlled, disciplined clenching of a man calmly formulating a counter-argument, but the frantic, defensive locking of a politician accustomed to absolute narrative dominance suddenly discovering that this specific storyline was masterfully engineered to entirely resist his control. Vance cast the third page aside and deliberately picked up the fourth. He stared down at the paper for a remarkably long, oppressive silence, the tension dragging painfully through the cavernous chamber. When he finally broke the silence, his entire demeanor had shifted. His voice didn't rise in volume or drop in register. Instead, it decelerated drastically, adopting the terrifying, meticulous cadence of a master surgeon, flawlessly selecting the precise scalpel needed to deliver the ultimate fatal incision. Vance warned the chamber that he was about to introduce a person they had absolutely never heard of, explicitly stating he would refrain from using her real name out of profound respect for her lasting, paralyzing terror of federal investigators. The ambient murmurs in the hearing room evaporated completely. Carter Page, Michael Flynn, and George Papadopoulos were known commodities, public figures caught in the shrapnel of partisan combat. What Vance held in his grasp was the soul-crushing tragedy of an ordinary citizen who never sought the spotlight and had been utterly obliterated by it. He presented her simply as Jennifer. Back in 2018, she was a 31-year-old woman, quietly executing mundane data entry tasks for a presidential campaign headquarters located in Ohio. For her labor, she earned a meager salary of $35,000 a year, a precise figure that mathematically allowed for the rental of a modest two-bedroom apartment and the ability to feed a single child. As he described her life, Vance entirely ignored Schiff, intentionally locking his piercing gaze directly onto the varied array of committee members and their stunned aides. The catastrophic inciting incident, Vance explained, occurred in 2018 when the horrifying might of the federal government crashed into Jennifer's fragile existence through a formal legal subpoena aggressively delivered by the special counsel's investigators. She hadn't violated any statutes. Her sole unforgivable offense was that she had mechanically processed one solitary email buried among tens of thousands that randomly contained a name that subsequently appeared on a list which was referenced in a dossier that ultimately served as the foundational bedrock for one of Senator Schiff's hyperventilating cable news monologues. Vance paused, allowing the sheer, sickening ridiculousness of the situation to hang thick in the air. A woman earning $35,000 annually was dragged into federal crosshairs simply for typing a name she neither wrote nor mentally registered. Vance broke down the brutal arithmetic. A federal subpoena absolutely mandates the retention of specialized legal counsel, and those attorneys command exorbitant fees ranging anywhere from $400 to $800 an hour. Vance grimly instructed the room to do the math, forcing every privileged politician to physically feel the devastating impact of a $400 hourly invoice slamming head-on into a $35,000 annual salary. Jennifer was forced to liquidate $22,000 to cover her legal expenses. It was the absolute totality of her life savings. The financial buffer essential for working-class survival was entirely incinerated simply to adequately respond to a weaponized legal inquiry that ultimately resulted in absolutely nothing. Vance's voice sank into a register of profound, agonizing resonance. He noted how Jennifer's name predictably never materialized in the final pages of the Mueller report. She was utterly discarded, much in the same way a violent, unfeeling tornado completely forgets the specific houses it has torn to shreds. Gazing down at the stark white paper, Vance recounted the tragic fallout. Jennifer's 6-year-old son had walked into their cramped kitchen to find his mother sobbing uncontrollably at the dining table. When the terrified boy asked why she was crying, Jennifer could only manage to choke out the words, "work stuff." The vice president's words cracked like a whip across the silent room as he demanded anyone to justify how a parent could possibly explain to a first grader that their entire financial security had been instantly vaporized because a powerful, immaculately tailored politician residing 3,000 miles away in California had decided to spin a fictional tale on national TV. You cannot explain the weaponization of the justice system to a 6-year-old. You just lie, wipe away the exhausted tears, and quietly prepare supper. Throughout this agonizing recounting, Adam Schiff did not interject a single time. His lips remained tightly sealed. The veteran prosecutor was completely paralyzed because there is no parliamentary maneuver that can counter the raw, unadulterated grief of a weeping mother and her scared child staring down a depleted bank balance. Vice President JD Vance meticulously placed the fourth page down onto the polished mahogany, his fingertips resting on the paper's edge before he slowly, intentionally picked up the fifth and final sheet. The climate in the chamber altered perceptibly. his face contorted into a mask of deep, overwhelming disgust, an emotion that projected a much more terrifying and icy intensity than simple partisan rage. He locked his uncompromising gaze straight onto Adam Schiff and quietly, yet distinctly, stated that the final name typed on that document belonged to the senator himself. Schiff's eyes fluttered rapidly in succession, signaling the very first involuntary physical flinch the veteran lawmaker had revealed all morning. Vance didn't pause. He launched his ultimate catastrophic offensive by surgically tearing apart the profoundly disturbing associates Schiff had opted to surround himself with. He dragged the grim, lingering shadow of Democratic megadonor Ed Buck straight into the blistering, unforgiving glare of the congressional inquiry. Vance painstakingly laid out the nauseating and horrific timeline. Buck had aggressively and enthusiastically injected $2,700 into Schiff's campaign coffers. In exchange, the senator had happily retained that dirty money throughout the gruesome, drug-fueled overdose deaths of two distinct black men who had perished inside Buck's infamous apartment. Even after Buck was formally convicted and found guilty of 9 serious felony counts, Schiff had obstinately held onto the bloodstained donation, only reluctantly issuing a reimbursement when the mounting public relations disaster finally morphed into an undeniable political liability. Vance made it crystal clear that this was no mere accounting mistake or clerical oversight. It was a cold-blooded, ruthless, and sociopathic calculation. Vance then mercilessly shifted to the devastating core of the financial disparities at work. He violently contrasted the excruciating, heartbreaking fate of Carter Page, an innocent man forced to sell his beloved residence just to legally defend against wholly fabricated treason charges, with the stunning, explosive revelation that Senator Adam Schiff was presently the main subject of an active criminal investigation. The probe was being spearheaded by the exact same Department of Justice that Schiff publicly claimed to defend. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Maryland had formally issued criminal referrals citing serious, systemic, and massive allegations of wire fraud, mail fraud, bank fraud, and the deliberate falsification of official financial records. The federal inquiry had violently uncovered Schiff's alleged doctoring of real estate documents to illegally secure highly favorable mortgage rates. He had brazenly listed a sprawling, luxurious mansion in Potomac, Maryland as his primary residential dwelling, while simultaneously declaring a condo in Burbank, California, as his official legal residence. One guiltless American was compelled to sell his cherished home entirely due to Schiff's broadcasted lies, while the senator himself was currently ensnared in a massive federal probe for allegedly committing perjury regarding the very roofs sheltering him. Vance relentlessly pushed forward to the next savage comparison, heavily weighing the total apocalyptic destruction of General Michael Flynn's 33-year military pension against the nauseating opulence of Schiff's fully operational multi-million-dollar legal defense fund. According to the latest financial disclosure filings, Schiff was sitting comfortably atop a colossal, impenetrable $1.2 million war chest. Flynn, on the other hand, possessed zero political shielding. He only had the intrinsic honor he had courageously earned in combat. Finally, Vance dropped the ultimate hammer on the most agonizing contrast of them all. Jennifer's obliterated $22,000 weighed against Schiff's untouchable empire. She possessed no shadowy political action committees and no wealthy benefactors writing blank checks. She had absolutely nothing but a rapidly depleting bank account, a profoundly terrified 6-year-old child, and a lifetime of grueling savings that vanished into the ether. Closing the slender manila file with a final decisive snap, Vance pushed it to the side and folded his hands deliberately on the desk. He summarized the massive, sweeping devastation of Schiff's 7-year crusade of terror. 423 cable news hits had directly stripped Carter Page of his livelihood, violently ripped the roof away from Michael Flynn, stolen 12 days of invaluable freedom from George Papadopoulos, and totally annihilated the financial bedrock of a blue-collar mother in Ohio. And yet, Vance observed, his voice plunging to a temperature of terrifying absolute zero, Those exact same fabricated tales had cost Adam Schiff absolutely nothing. The word nothing hung in the suffocating atmosphere of the committee room like a colossal, inescapable death sentence. Vice President JD Vance slowly pushed his heavy leather chair back and rose to his full stature. It wasn't the aggressive, domineering stance of a veteran politician pulling off a calculated tactical power maneuver. Instead, it was the heavy, exhausted bearing of a man standing up purely because the physical act of rising injected the final moment with the necessary, undeniable gravity it required. He locked his unyielding gaze with Schiff across the 12-foot chasm separating the towering dais from the lonely witness table. Vance declared to the hushed chamber that he had one final solitary question left to pose. It was a question utterly devoid of complex legal architecture, FISA procedural nuances, or convoluted campaign finance regulations. It was a profoundly, brutally, and fundamentally human inquiry. Have you ever apologized to Carter Page? The silence that instantly smothered the massive room was absolute, complete, and profoundly terrifying. 1 second elapsed, 2 seconds ticked away. The dense mahogany walls of the Dirksen Senate office building seemed to physically constrict around the people inside. Have you ever called Michael Flynn? Vance pressed, his deadpan voice utterly unwavering, the man who sold his house because of your television appearances and said, "I'm sorry I called you a Russian agent before the evidence was in." 3 seconds, 4 seconds. The frantic, mechanical snapping of press camera shutters acted as the only rhythmic pulse in the completely paralyzed room. Have you ever contacted George Papadopoulos, who was 28 years old, who had a dream about working in government, whose name you used as a talking point on CNN and said, "I'm sorry," 5 seconds, 6 seconds. The building tension was suffocating, thick enough to physically choke on. Have you ever thought about Jennifer? Vance's voice had now dropped to a barely audible, emotion-laden whisper, making the highly tuned committee microphone strain to capture the raw, unfiltered sentiment that his vocal cords could scarcely sustain. He expanded the devastating question to encompass the invisible, forgotten army of collateral damage, the countless data entry clerks, the enthusiastic weekend campaign volunteers, and the entry-level staffers who had violently hemorrhaged their life savings because Schiff's broadcasted fantasies had miraculously mutated their mundane, ordinary jobs into terrifying federal investigations. Have you ever thought about them at all? 7 seconds. 8, 9, 10. Adam Schiff remained utterly immobilized at the witness desk. His hands were placed perfectly flat on the gleaming wooden surface, the defensive, desperate posture of a man who suddenly found himself with absolutely nothing left to physically hold on to. His spine stayed flawlessly straight, strictly trained by 24 years of savage, unrelenting congressional combat to never physically fold under intense public pressure. But it was precisely that rigid, statuesque perfection that served as his ultimate, undeniable tell. When an individual is genuinely relaxed, they subconsciously shift their weight, adjust their clothing, or organically move their hands. Schiff was completely petrified, holding the frightening stillness of a trapped animal, acutely aware that any microscopic physical movement would instantly be read as a catastrophic admission of profound, uncontrollable guilt. His jaw was clamped firmly, suffocating lock of a man who had finally collided with a question that his prestigious Stanford law degree and his thousands of hours of cable news dominance had completely failed to prepare him to answer. Directly behind Schiff, his senior legislative assistant was intensely staring down at her own trembling hands. She refused to look up at Vance, and she absolutely declined to stare at the back of her boss's head. The undeniable truth was that the genius, invincible Adam Schiff was fundamentally powerless to answer a basic moral question that a small child could effortlessly comprehend. It was a binary inquiry regarding basic human empathy. Have you ever apologized? The honest, devastating reality, the answer that every single senator, journalist, and millions of Americans watching from home already knew in their bones was a deafening no. He had never extended a solitary apology to anyone for anything throughout his entire 24-year career. The physical act of verbally admitting that horrifying lack of compassion allowed during a sworn Senate hearing, while staring directly into the eyes of a vice president who had just resurrected the phantoms of the lives he had ruined, was a psychological barrier that Adam Schiff's finely tuned programming simply could not shatter. 11 seconds. 12 seconds. Vance slowly, grimly nodded his head. It was the final, solemn nod of a man who had successfully extracted his answer, fully understanding that the roaring, cowardly silence emanating from the witness table was infinitely louder and vastly more damning than any polished lie Schiff could have ever delivered. "I didn't think so," Vance noted, his voice completely deadpan. Gesturing one last time at the thin manila folder containing the 5 decimated lives, Vance delivered the fatal strike. "The stories were free for you, Senator. They cost everyone else everything." With a violent sweeping motion, Vance slammed the wooden gavel down, throwing the proceedings into an immediate permanent recess. In the profound, suffocating silence that hung unnaturally long after the sharp crack of the wood, Adam Schiff remained completely frozen, his palms glued flat to the desk, his lips sealed tight. He was the petrified monument of a man who had spent 24 years weaponizing the spoken word, finally immobilized by the one question that speaking could never, ever repair. When the digital floodgates eventually burst, the viral fallout did not respect the traditional anticipated limits of contemporary political media. The specific video clip that completely dominated the cultural zeitgeist belonged entirely and exclusively to Jennifer. It was a chilling, heart-wrenching 44-second segment of a 6-year-old boy asking his mom why she was crying at their kitchen table. Distilling raw, unfiltered human ruin into just 22 spoken words, the footage completely circumvented partisan echo chambers and racked up an astounding 47 million views in less than 3 days. It was aggressively circulated by burnt-out single mothers, terrified parents, and everyday Americans who instinctively grasped the life-shattering nightmare of suddenly losing $22,000 to the federal justice machine. A secondary viral shockwave rapidly formed around the sickening financial hypocrisy. An unnamed user generated a lethal split-screen image comparing General Flynn's recently liquidated modest Virginia residence with Schiff's massive, opulent Potomac compound. The accompanying text was deadly simple. One man liquidated his house to cover the costs of a crime he didn't commit, while the other was currently being investigated for lying about his own property. This graphic exploded across the internet, reshared 2.4 million times in a matter of hours. Vance's chilling question also ignited the number "Say You're Sorry" trend, a relentless organic cultural wave that monopolized Twitter for 2 full days. Voters started aggressively recording their local representatives, demanding ethical transparency. At the exact same time, the California Republican Party launched a statewide direct mail campaign comparing Schiff's $1.8 million legal defense fund against Carter Page's forfeited home, right as Page officially announced a massive civil defamation suit. Miles away, hidden on the 3rd floor of the Hart Senate office building, 27-year-old legislative aide Dorothy Chen sat utterly frozen at her cramped, cluttered desk. She was an invisible, exhausted cog in the colossal legislative machine. Pulling in exactly $52,000 annually, Dorothy frantically ran through her mental bank accounts and realized she absolutely did not have $22,000 to burn on an attorney just to dodge federal incarceration. Glaring at the monitor, displaying Schiff's torturous 12-second mute reaction, she murmured, "That's what it looks like when the words run out." 1,000 miles distant, 44-year-old Marcus Webb sat idling inside his dirty Ford pickup in a Columbus, Ohio parking lot. Back in 2016, Marcus had merely volunteered 2 weekends to hammer Trump campaign signs into frozen front yards. By 2018, he was hit with a horrifying legal subpoena. A local lawyer wrote a single brief response and ruthlessly charged Marcus $3,200. That invoice completely vaporized Marcus's rainy day fund, which he had meticulously scraped together over 6 years by stashing away $50 from every paycheck. The committee never reached out to him again. Marcus grumbled to his loyal yellow lab biscuit about the mafia-level price of engaging in the democratic process. He had started saving $50 a paycheck again, but it now felt like a horrifying, endless tax demanded to keep a microscopic layer of protection against the weaponized paranoia of Washington, D.C. Senator Adam Schiff had pompously attempted to dismiss the hearing as a partisan vendetta, but Vice President J.D. Vance had coldly transformed it into a devastating, inescapable ledger of the ruined Carter Page, never charged, forever unemployable. Michael Flynn, forced to sell off his family's roof. George Papadopoulos, made to suffer 12 agonizing days in a federal cell. Jennifer, forced to incinerate $22,000 in crushing legal debt. And towering over the wreckage sat Adam Schiff, arrogantly holding a $1.2 million legal defense chest and zero capacity to muster a single apology. As the camera shutters finally stopped firing and the mahogany chamber emptied, leaving only the ghosts of the shattered lives floating above the polished wood of the witness table, the American public was left staring straight into the terrifying dead eyes of a political apparatus that devours its own citizens without a moment's hesitation. The deafening silence from Adam Schiff had ultimately delivered the absolute answer, yet the far more terrifying, enduring reality, still echoing throughout the empty halls of Washington, was simply this: who would the system choose to annihilate next?